The hands were shaking. Samuel saw it. The jury didn't. The judge didn't. Paul Anderson, his boss, his mentor, didn't. But Samuel saw it, and he knew what it meant. Teresa Caldwell sat on the witness stand, swearing under oath that Susan Ashford had fired in cold blood, that there was no threat, no justification, no self-defense. Her voice was steady. Her words were precise, but her hands trembled against the wooden rail like leaves in a storm. Samuel's pen moved across his notepad, circling the same observation over and over. Shaking. Why shaking? Stress? Fear? Lying? He glanced at Paul Anderson, seated beside him at the defense table. Tailored navy suit, Harvard ring catching the fluorescent light, confidence radiating from every pore. Paul was smiling slightly. He thought they were winning. Samuel leaned closer. Paul, her testimony doesn't match the police report. She said Susan was standing. The report says she was crouched behind the car door, and look at her hands. Paul didn't look up from his notes. Not now, Samuel. But if we cross-examine on the positioning, I said not now. Paul's tone was final, dismissive, the way it always was. Samuel sat back, jaw tight. This was the third time he'd brought it up. The third time Paul had waved him off like he was a child interrupting adult conversation. Samuel Foster, Columbia Law, top 15% of his class, 2 years of 16-hour days building cases for Paul's firm, was just the assistant, the help, invisible. During the recess, Samuel locked himself in the courthouse bathroom. He pulled out his phone and opened his email drafts. The resignation letter was already written. Dear Paul, effective immediately, I am resigning from my position at Anderson & Associates. Thank you for the opportunity. Samuel Foster Short. Professional. Final. His thumb hovered over the send button. 2 years. 2 years of being ignored, of watching Paul take credit for his research, of sitting in the back of courtrooms while Paul basked in the spotlight. 2 years of being told he was learning when really he was just being used. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, a black man in a cheap suit that didn't quite fit, working for a white lawyer who'd never see him as anything more than a stepping stool. His finger moved toward the screen. One tap, and he'd be free. One tap, and he'd never have to swallow his voice again. The bathroom door swung open. Another attorney walked in, barely glancing at him. Samuel looked at the email one more time. Then he closed his phone and walked back into the courtroom. Not because he'd changed his mind, but because he owed it to Susan Ashford to see this through. After today, he was done. Paul Anderson stood before the jury, delivering his closing argument with the kind of polish that came from 15 years of winning. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is clear. My client, Ms. Susan Ashford, acted in self-defense. She had no choice. The prosecution's witness has provided testimony, but we must ask ourselves, does it align with the physical evidence? Does it make sense? Samuel almost laughed. Paul was using his words. The argument Samuel had drafted. The angle Samuel had researched. The strategy Samuel had mapped out at 2 in the morning while Paul slept in his brownstone. And Paul delivered it like it was his own brilliant insight. Samuel's hand tightened around his pen. Almost done. Just get through today. Then send the email. Then disappear. But then Judge Harrison looked up from the bench. And everything changed. Judge Harrison was a silver-haired man with sharp eyes and 30 years of seeing through courtroom performances. He adjusted his glasses and let his gaze drift across the defense table. It stopped on Samuel. For 3 full seconds, the judge just looked at him. Then he spoke. Counselor Anderson, before we proceed, who is the young man seated beside you? The courtroom went quiet. Paul turned, almost surprised to remember Samuel was there. Your Honor, that's Samuel Foster. He's my legal assistant. Legal assistant, Judge Harrison repeated slowly, like he was tasting the words. Paul nodded. Yes, Your Honor. He helps with research, case prep, administrative tasks. Judge Harrison leaned forward. Mr. Foster, do you have a law degree? Samuel stood, heart pounding. Yes, Your Honor. Columbia Law. Graduated 2 years ago. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge's eyebrows lifted. Columbia. And you're working as an assistant? Paul jumped in smoothly, that easy courtroom charm sliding into place. He's still gaining experience, Your Honor, learning the ropes under my mentorship. It's important for young lawyers to understand how things work before they— Mr. Foster, the judge interrupted, eyes still locked on Samuel during Mrs. Caldwell's testimony. You took extensive notes. I noticed you circling something repeatedly on your pad. What was it? Samuel's throat went dry. Every instinct screamed at him to defer to Paul, to stay in his lane, to remain invisible. But the judge wasn't asking Paul. He was asking him. Samuel's voice came out steady. Her hands, Your Honor. Her hands? Yes, sir. Ms. Caldwell claimed she witnessed the shooting from 15 feet away. She described the defendant's actions in precise detail. Posture, hand positioning, even the angle of the firearm. But her hands shook the entire time she testified. Paul cleared his throat sharply. Your Honor, I'm not sure what relevance— Judge Harrison raised one hand. Silence fell like a curtain. Go on, Mr. Foster. Samuel took a breath. This was it. The cliff edge. Jump or stay safe. He jumped. Ms. Caldwell described events that would require steady, clear observation under extreme stress. But her testimony included details that don't match the police report filed the night of the incident. She stated Ms. Ashford fired from a standing position. The report clearly indicates the defendant was crouched behind her car door for cover. Paul's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching near his temple. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. I'll decide what's irregular in my courtroom, Counselor. Judge Harrison's voice could have frozen water. He turned back to Samuel. Mr. Foster, did you bring this discrepancy to Mr. Anderson's attention? The question hung in the air like a blade. Samuel glanced at Paul. Paul's face was stone, but his eyes were screaming, "Don't you dare." Samuel looked back at the judge. I did, Your Honor. His voice was quiet but clear. 3 times. The courtroom erupted. Whispers crashed over each other like waves. The jury shifted in their seats. The gallery leaned forward. Judge Harrison's gavel came down once. Sharp. Final. Order. Silence. He looked at Paul. Counselor? Paul stood slowly, composing himself with visible effort. Your Honor, Mr. Foster is still learning how to properly evaluate witness reliability in a courtroom setting. I made a judgment call based on years of trial experience. You made a judgment call, the judge interrupted, his tone colder than Samuel had ever heard from a bench, to ignore a factual inconsistency that could exonerate your own client. Paul opened his mouth, closed it, said nothing. Judge Harrison turned back to Samuel, and for just a moment, there was something in his eyes that looked like respect. Mr. Foster, if you were lead counsel on this case, what would you do right now? Samuel's pulse roared in his ears. This was the moment, the one that would define everything that came after. Stay invisible and safe, or step into the light and risk it all. He looked at Susan Ashford. She was staring at him with desperate, pleading eyes. She'd been silent too. For too long, just like him. Samuel straightened his shoulders. I'd request a recess, Your Honor, and I'd ask permission to recall Teresa Caldwell to the stand for cross-examination. The judge granted the recess. 30 minutes later, Teresa Caldwell sat back on the witness stand, visibly uncomfortable, hands clasped so tightly in her lap, her knuckles had gone white. Paul Anderson was not questioning her. Samuel Foster was. He stood slowly, holding a single sheet of paper, the police report, and approached the stand. His hands were steady now, all those nights reviewing case files while Paul took clients to dinner. All those hours Paul had dismissed as grunt work. All those moments Samuel had bitten his tongue while watching his insights get ignored. They had led here. Ms. Caldwell, he began, voice calm and clear. You testified earlier that you were 15 feet away from the defendant when the shooting occurred. Is that correct? Yes. Her voice wavered slightly. And you said you had a clear, unobstructed view of Miss Ashford's actions? Yes. Samuel nodded slowly. You also stated under oath that Ms. Ashford was standing upright when she fired the weapon. Correct? Teresa hesitated, eyes darting to the prosecution table. Yes. Samuel placed the police report on the rail in front of her. This is the official police report filed the night of the incident by Officer Ramirez, the first responder. It states clearly that the defendant was crouched behind the driver's side door of her vehicle, using it as cover. How do you explain that discrepancy? Teresa stared at the report. Her hands started shaking again. I don't know. Maybe I remembered it wrong. Maybe, Samuel said softly. Memory can be unreliable under stress. But you also testified that you saw Ms. Ashford raise the weapon with both hands in a classic shooter's stance. The report indicates she fired with one hand while using the car door for shield with the other. These aren't small details, Ms. Caldwell. They're fundamentally different accounts of the same event. Sweat beaded on Teresa's forehead. Samuel took a step closer, his voice gentle but relentless. Ms. Caldwell, were you actually 15 feet away from the defendant during the shooting? Silence. The courtroom held its breath. Or were you somewhere else entirely? Teresa's lip trembled, her eyes filled with tears. She swallowed hard. I was inside my apartment, across the street, on the 3rd floor. Gasps erupted through the gallery. Samuel didn't react, didn't show triumph or shock, just kept going. So you didn't have a clear view of the defendant's exact position? No. It came out as a whisper. You couldn't see whether she was standing or crouching? No. You couldn't see how she held the weapon? No. Then why, Ms. Caldwell, did you testify under oath that you could? Teresa's voice broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Because they told me what to say. The room exploded. Judge Harrison's gavel cracked like thunder. Order. Order. It took 3 strikes before the chaos subsided. The judge's face had gone dark with fury. Ms. Caldwell, who told you what to say? She raised a shaking hand and pointed directly at the prosecution table. At the assistant district attorney who'd been sitting there smugly for 2 days. He did. The prosecutor shot to his feet, face red. Your Honor, this is absurd. This witness is clearly... Sit. Down. Counselor. Judge Harrison's voice could have shattered glass. The prosecutor sat. The judge turned back to Teresa, his anger giving way to something gentler. Mrs. Caldwell, are you stating under oath that you were coached by the prosecution to provide false testimony in this trial? Teresa nodded through her tears. They came to my apartment 3 days before the trial. They said if I didn't cooperate, they'd charge me as an accessory. They said no one would believe me anyway if I told the truth. They just needed someone, anyone, to say they saw it happen the way they wanted. Susan Ashford buried her face in her hands, her whole body shaking with sobs. Samuel stepped back from the witness stand. His part was done. Judge Harrison's face had gone pale with controlled rage. Bailiff, take Ms. Caldwell into protective custody immediately. Someone get the district attorney on the phone right now. Counselor, he pointed at the prosecutor. You will remain in this courtroom until the police arrive to escort you out. He took a breath, visibly trying to compose himself. This trial is over. Miss Ashford, the charges against you are dismissed with prejudice. You are free to go. And you have this court's deepest apology for what you have endured. Susan collapsed into her daughter's arms, both of them weeping. Judge Harrison's eyes found Samuel again across the courtroom. Mr. Foster approached the bench. Samuel walked forward on unsteady legs. The judge spoke quietly, but his words carried the weight of 3 decades on the bench. What you did today took more than legal skill, son. It took courage. It took integrity. And it took refusing to accept that your voice doesn't matter. He paused. This profession needs people like you. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Not ever. Understand? Samuel's throat was too tight to speak. He just nodded. Now get out of here, you've earned it. The case collapsed within the hour. The assistant district attorney was removed from the case and immediately suspended, facing a criminal ethics investigation and possible disbarment. The district attorney held an emergency press conference, promising a full review of the office's practices. Susan Ashford walked out of the courthouse a free woman, surrounded by her family, her life restored. And Samuel Foster stood alone in the hallway outside the courtroom, staring at the marble floor, trying to process what had just happened. Paul Anderson approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The courthouse hummed around them, attorneys rushing between courtrooms, clients conferring in hushed tones, the machinery of justice grinding forward, indifferent to individual victories or defeats. Then Paul spoke, his voice tight and controlled. "You humiliated me in there." Samuel looked up, met his eyes. "I saved your client. You overstepped. I did my job." Paul's face twisted with something ugly, pride wounded, ego bruised. "You were my assistant. You were supposed to stay quiet, to learn, to follow my lead, to trust my judgment." Samuel's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I followed your lead for 2 years, Paul. I researched every one of your cases. I wrote your briefs. I found the precedents that won your arguments. I stayed late when you went home. I worked weekends while you played golf. And every single time I brought you something that mattered, something that could have made a real difference, you dismissed it." He paused. "You dismissed me." Paul said nothing. "You didn't mentor me," Samuel continued, his voice steady and clear. "You used me. You built your reputation on my work and never gave me credit. Never even acknowledged I existed. And today, when it mattered most, when an innocent woman's freedom hung in the balance, you were willing to let her go to prison because your ego couldn't handle the possibility that you might be wrong." Paul's jaw clenched so hard Samuel could see the muscle jumping. "You'll never work in this city again. I'll make certain of it. I know every judge, every firm, I don't need to work for you to practice law, Paul." The words hung in the air between them. Paul's face went red. "You're making a mistake. A huge mistake. You'll regret this." Samuel turned and started walking away. "No," he said quietly, more to himself than to Paul. "You will." Behind him, he heard Paul call out, "You're nothing without me. You hear me? Nothing." Samuel kept walking. He didn't look back. 3 months later, Samuel opened his own practice. It wasn't impressive by Paul Anderson's standards. 1 room above a deli in a neighborhood where Paul would never venture. A desk Samuel had bought secondhand from a law school graduate who was giving up and going into real estate. A chair that creaked when he leaned back. A single file cabinet. A coffee maker that was older than he was. But it was his. The cheap suit, the one that had made him invisible, stayed in the back of his closet, still in its dry cleaning bag. Samuel bought a new suit, not expensive. Nothing like Paul's tailored wool, but it fit properly. And when he looked in the mirror wearing it, he saw himself. Not an assistant, a lawyer. Susan Ashford was his first client, pro bono. She wanted to file a civil suit against the prosecutor's office for malicious prosecution, violation of her civil rights, and emotional distress. Samuel took the case. He worked 16-hour days, just like he had for Paul. But this time, the victory would be his. The credit would be his. The voice would be his. He survived on coffee, determination, and the memory of what it felt like to finally be heard. He built his arguments brick by brick, the way he'd learned to do in the shadow of men who'd never given him credit. 6 months later, he stood in federal court and won. The settlement was substantial, enough to change Susan's life, enough to send a message. The system could be held accountable, even by someone it had tried to keep invisible. The verdict made headlines. Local news picked it up, then national outlets. Not because of the money, though it was significant, but because of the story. The assistant who'd stood up, the voice that refused to stay silent. Word spread, quietly at first, then louder. People started seeking Samuel out. Not the wealthy clients Paul Anderson courted, the corporate executives, the trust fund kids, the people who could afford to make problems disappear. Samuel's clients were different. They were the ones who needed someone who understood what it meant to be overlooked, to be underestimated, to be dismissed before you even opened your mouth. He took their cases, and he won. Not every time. The law didn't work that way. But enough. Enough that his phone kept ringing. Enough that he had to hire help. enough that other firms started noticing. Partnership offers arrived, corner offices, six-figure salaries. Samuel turned them all down, because he'd already learned what happened when you worked for people who saw you as invisible. Meanwhile, across town, Paul Anderson's carefully constructed empire began to crack. It started small, a client here, a client there, people who'd heard about the Ashford case, people who started asking questions. If Paul Anderson ignored evidence that could free an innocent woman, what else had he overlooked? If he'd been willing to dismiss his own assistant's concerns, whose voice else had he silenced? If he'd been more concerned with his ego than with justice, how many cases had been mishandled? The questions multiplied. Associates started leaving Anderson and Associates. First a trickle, then a flood. They'd all felt it. The same dismissiveness Samuel had endured. The same sense that their work only mattered when Paul could claim credit for it. 6 months after the Ashford trial, Samuel heard through a former colleague that Paul had lost the Harper case, a wrongful termination suit worth millions, one he should have won easily. But he'd ignored his paralegal's research about a key precedent. The paralegal had quit the week after Samuel left. The pattern had continued, and this time it had cost Paul everything. 1 year after opening his practice, Samuel received an envelope in the mail. No return address, expensive stationery, the kind Paul had always used for client correspondence. Inside was a single sentence, handwritten in Paul's distinctive script. "I should have listened." Samuel stared at it for a long time. He felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not vindication, just a deep, quiet sadness. For all the potential that had been wasted. For all the cases that could have been handled better if Paul had just been willing to listen. For all the people who might have been helped if ego hadn't stood in the way of justice. He folded the note carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, not as a trophy, as a reminder of what he would never become. 2 years after the Ashford trial, Samuel's practice had grown beyond what he'd imagined possible. He had 3 associates now. He'd chosen them carefully, not for their connections or their pedigree, but for their hunger, their integrity, their resilience. One was a young woman named Maria who'd graduated top of her class from a state school, but couldn't get hired at any major firm because she didn't have the right background, code for the right skin color, the right last name, the right connections. Samuel made her his lead associate within 6 months. She was brilliant, fearless, and she reminded him of himself. Late one evening, as Samuel was reviewing a brief, his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Foster?" A young voice. Male. Nervous. "My name is David Chen. I'm a second-year law student at NYU. I heard about what you did. In the Ashford case." Samuel leaned back in his chair. "Okay, everyone told me you were just an assistant, that you didn't have any real authority, that you should have stayed quiet." "They did, but you didn't." "No," Samuel said quietly. "I didn't." There was a pause. Then, "I'm applying for summer internships. Every firm I've talked to, they look at my resume and they see potential. But when I walk in the room, they see something different. They see someone who should be grateful just to be there. Someone who should stay quiet and learn their place." Samuel closed his eyes. He knew exactly what David meant. "Mr. Foster," David continued, his voice stronger now, "I don't want to be invisible. I don't want to spend years waiting for permission to use my voice. So I wanted to ask, are you hiring?" Samuel smiled. "Come by my office tomorrow morning. Let's talk." Samuel never forgot what it felt like to be invisible. The weight of sitting in courtrooms where no one looked at you. The frustration of having the right answer and being ignored. The exhaustion of working twice as hard for half the recognition. The rage of watching injustice unfold because someone with power couldn't be bothered to listen. He carried those memories with him every single day. And he made sure that in his practice, in his courtroom, in every case he touched, no one would ever feel that way again. Not his associates, not his clients, not the witnesses who came to him terrified that no one would believe them. Everyone would be seen. Everyone would be heard. Because Samuel had learned the most important lesson the law could teach. The most dangerous thing in the world isn't being underestimated, it's staying silent when you know the truth. And once you find your voice, you never let anyone take it away. Years later, Samuel would walk past the courthouse where it all happened. Sometimes he'd see young lawyers rushing up the steps, nervous and eager, carrying briefcases that looked too big for them. Some were black, some were brown, some were women. Some looked like they'd never belonged anywhere that mattered. And Samuel would think about Teresa Caldwell's shaking hands, about Judge Harrison's question, about Paul Anderson's dismissal, about the moment he almost sent that resignation email, about the choice to speak instead of staying silent. He'd think about Susan Ashford's tears when the charges were dismissed, about Maria's first solo victory in court, about David Chen, now a third-year associate, arguing motions with the same fire Samuel had once felt. And he'd smile, because the world was full of people waiting to be heard, and Samuel Foster was listening.